Okay, I hope everybody is back from that short lunch break. I'm Teru Konishi. I'm a PhD student at UCL, and I'll be chairing this panel. And it is my pleasure to introduce Diana Mazzarella and Christophe Heintz for their presentation on the literalist mode of interpretation. So let's just get started, please, Diana.
Thanks, Teru. So, indeed, this presentation represents, I would say, the starting point of a joint project with Christophe, which aims to take as an object of study for cognitive pragmatics what we can refer to as folk judgments about literal meaning. That is, non-expert, pre-theoretical evaluations that ordinary speakers make on what was literally meant by a given utterance. Today, I'm going to suggest that judgments about literal meaning stem from a specific mode of interpretation, which occurs in situations with potential conflict over what was meant, and which involves reflective and counterfactual thinking. So the idea in which we have thought of organizing this presentation is to devote the first part to the why question of the literalist mode of interpretation. So why do we employ such a mode of interpretation? And then move to the how question, which is how is this literalist mode of interpretation cognitively implemented? So I'm going to start with the why question. And to begin with, I would like to raise your intuitions about how, when, under which circumstances as speakers, we care about literal meaning. And I hope you will agree that in our day-to-day life, we rarely wonder about what was literally meant. We just wonder about what was meant. Still, some specific concerns and judgments about literal meaning occur in some situations in which interests are possibly misaligned. And before reviewing these type of situations, I would like to point out that as a theorist, we can endorse the idea that literal meaning has no role to play as a computational stage in pragmatic processing, but at the same time be interested in folk judgments about literal meaning. So the Gricean-inspired view that pragmatic processes occur after the literal meaning is computed, that was often referred to as the two-stage model of interpretation, has been convincingly refuted on empirical grounds. And current pragmatic theories, including relevant theory, maintain that there is no mandatory literal first stage, and that interpretation directly aims at relevance. And as a result, we might even wonder, do we still need a notion of literal meaning? And the answer that we want to suggest today is that yes, we do need a notion of literal meaning, but we need a new notion of literal meaning which corresponds to what people say then literal meaning is. So I would like to invite you to consider under which circumstances judgments about literal meaning are likely to arise. And to do so, let me take an instance of strategic communication that, in our view, represents a paradigmatic example of communicative scenarios in which judgments about literal meaning may play a crucial role. So consider this example, these utterance. Donations were made and decisions were made shortly after, which could be uttered by a speaker who intends to insinuate that a certain political party acted corruptly. So it is plausible to assume that in a certain conversational context, the addressee may attribute to the speaker the intention to communicate that donations were made by some relevant corporations, and as a result, policy decisions favorable to these same corporations were made by the party shortly after, where you see in blue all these relevant pragmatic enrichments that are inferred by the addressee. Now, with these utterance, the speaker insinuates the party's corruption, but does so in a way that allows them to retreat to more innocent interpretation if later challenged. For instance, if openly confronted, the speaker may appeal to various possible denials that I've listed here. I merely stated that donations occurred and later unrelated decisions were made. There's no implied causal connection. I never specified who made the donations. I never said that the policy decisions favored the donors. In fact, the corporations were not happy with them. I never said that those decisions were made by the party. Indeed, they were made by an independent agency. So all these are possible denials that reveal judgments about literal meaning. And how these judgments can be used strategically in an argumentative context is going to be the object of our discussion. So we want to suggest that we care about literal meaning when the speaker is motivated to convey controversial content while preserving deniability, and the addressee is motivated to anticipate or challenge denials. And here I've just listed a few examples presented by Pinker in his work on deniability and the theory of the strategic speaker that illustrate how deniability considerations might be particularly relevant in a variety of contexts involving sexual commands, threats, citations for donations, bribes, just to mention a few examples. So we care about literal meaning when there are strategic interests at stake, when there is a potential for conflict or misunderstanding, when speakers wish to deny having communicated something controversial, and in all those settings in which institutional norms demand explicit communication. Things, for instance, about the courtroom context as a paradigmatic case of such an institutional setting. So the hypothesis that we want to put forth in light of these observations is that invoking literal meaning serves primarily social and argumentative functions, so that judgments about literal meaning play a role in arguments about what was meant and provide reasons to ascribe a specific communicative intention. So having provided an answer to the why question that I raised before, I would like now to move to the how question. So how are judgments about literal meaning formed? How is the literalist mode of interpretation cognitively implemented? And the hypothesis that we would like to put forth is that judgments about literal meaning arise from a distinct literalist mode of interpretation, which is based on a reflective process that involves counterfactual thinking. So as such, our position is radically different from so-called two stages model of interpretation, and we maintain that literal meaning has no role to play in intuitive interpretation. So literal meaning should not, judgments about literal meaning should not be conceived as the result of introspective access to a computational stage of intuitive interpretation, but rather as the result of a specific mode of interpretation, which, as I said, is, to begin with, a reflective mode of interpretation. So I'm going to focus on this feature and try to clarify what we have in mind here by spending a few words on the distinction between intuitive and reflective interpretation. Here you see a characterization of intuitive interpretations that we find in relevance theory I quote Diderot when she says that inferential comprehension starts from the recovery of a linguistically encoded meaning, which is typically quite fragmentary and incomplete. The hearer takes the linguistically decoded meaning, and following a path of least effort, he uses available contextual information to enrich it at the explicit level and complement it at the implicit level until the resulting interpretation meets his expectations of relevance, at which point he stops. So this is intuitive interpretation according to relevance theory, and we are going to endorse this view of intuitive interpretation and compare these with what we call reflective interpretation, that is functionally related to the investigation of the reasons that an addressee might have for ascribing a specific communicative intention to a communicator. So the reasons to ascribe to the speaker the intention to communicate that P. And is the type of reflective interpretations which we take to be at place, for instance, when we attempt to answer questions such as, what did Jesus mean? Or what did Lacan mean? What is always Orwell talking about in Animal Farm? Now, the suggestion we want to make draws on the distinction between intuitive and reflective inferences that was spelled out by Mercier and Sperber, and applies these to the domain of pragmatic interpretation. The idea would be that reflective interpretation is a deliberate, reiterated use of basic interpretative mechanisms. So the idea is that reflective interpretation involves the reiteration of the processes of basic interpretation, with the specific note that at each iteration, the linguistic evidence is kept stable, and the range of contextual information against which the same linguistic evidence is interpreted varies. And I'm going to illustrate these to begin with by looking at literary interpretation, which is one case of reflective interpretation. So in literary interpretation, the available contextual information is typically enriched at every iteration. And here I quote the beautiful work of Anne Furlong on literary interpretation in relevance theory, in which she writes that the reader aiming at a literary interpretation should make sure that this interpretation is warranted by the text and by any other evidence he can discover. It may provide evidence, for example, about the original meaning of a word whose meaning has changed, of the writer's assumptions and attitudes as expressed in related text. So the idea here is the reader would gather additional evidence that can be brought to bear on the interpretation process, which is repeated and leads to rethinking what is meant in view, for instance, of the writer's whole literary production or their sociocultural and political context. Now, as I said before, our hypothesis is that judgments about literal meaning are the result of reflective interpretation, but of a specific type of reflective interpretation, one that involves counterfactual thinking. So the idea is that reiterated interpretation of the same linguistic evidence can take place against alternative counterfactual context that involve different subsets of available contextual information. And once again here, I quote Diderot to remind you of the potentially wide array of contextual information that can be used in interpretation. She writes, there is no principal limit on the type of contextual information that may be required or the source from which it may come. The interpretation of prior discourse, observation of the physical environment, encyclopedic memory, knowledge of the speaker, cultural, scientific, or religious assumptions, exercise of the imagination, and so on. Crucially, though, contextual information differs with respect to its salience and its epistemic strength, or its acceptability, the likelihood that it will be accepted as true by the interlocutors and that would go unchallenged. So what we want to suggest is that counterfactual reinterpretations typically work by eliminating less salient and epistemically weaker contextual information, with the specification that, of course, what counts as good enough contextual evidence depends on the strategic interest at stake. And I will use an example in a minute to illustrate this point. But before that, let me just state that our suggestion is that judgments about literal meaning target the convergence point of counterfactual reinterpretation. And I hope the following example will help illustrate this claim. So let's go back to this example of strategic communication that I have introduced before, and the spontaneous interpretation that an utterance like this could receive in a given context. Now, these spontaneous interpretations would be the results of different contextual informations playing a role in the interpretative process, contextual information coming from word knowledge. When two politically significant events are temporally contiguous, they are probably related. Corporations donate to political parties not randomly, but with the expectations of favorable treatment. Political decisions are typically made by the party that holds power or influence. Political actors are in practice influenced by financial contributions, to mention a few, but also knowledge about the speaker, for instance, knowledge that the speaker has a critical attitude towards the party, or prior discourse, previous statements that the speaker could have made, like that the party has always put private interest ahead of public good. Or observation of the physical environment, for instance, direct evidence of the fact that the official donation registries report recent donations, as well, of course, linguistic conventions, which are typically highly salient and epistemically strong assumption. The assumption that the speaker is a competent user of the language that she speaks hardly goes challenged. And what I want to illustrate is how, in two different scenarios, this range of contextual assumption could be narrowed down strategically. So, for instance, during a radio interview, the speaker and the journalist are discussing the issue of the relationship between corporate donations and political independence, and the speaker is pressed by the journalist who's asking, are you suggesting a link between the donation and the policy decisions? Are you accusing the party of corruption for favoring the corporations? That's a serious claim. Now, these questions reveal, we want to argue, the journalist's judgment about what the speaker literally meant, and the journalist's effort to avoid potential misunderstandings and clarify the speaker's commitment and push the speaker to go on record. So these questions reveal that there are judgments about literal meaning at stakes in this conversational context that we argue might result from the convergence point of different counterfactual reinterpretation. For instance, counterfactual reinterpretations like in one that exclude contextual information about the existence of causal link between political significant events that happen one after the other, which, as you can see in the illustration here, is taken out, so it's not considered as part of what we can strongly ascribe to the speaker as their communicative intention, or other aspects of the pragmatic enrichments discussed before. So that the judgment about literal meaning would be the resulting of the convergence point of these counterfactual interpretations, and paraphrasable along these lines. Donations were made by some relevant corporations, and policy decisions were made by the party shortly after. And let me just continue by illustrating how, in a slightly different scenario, we could arrive at even more stringent judgments about literal meaning. So, for instance, the case of a parliamentary ethics investigation in which a corruption investigation is underway and the speaker is being questioned by the committee seeking to assess the veracity of corruption allegations. So you said that donations were made and decisions follow. Could you clarify who made those donations? So you see that in this context, the question of the committee reveals that the judgment about literal meaning at issue is based on an even narrower set of contextual assumptions, and that the person asking the question is not willing to take responsibility for attributing to the speaker the intention to refer to donations made by the relevant corporations. So in this case, the judgment about literal meaning that you see here could be paraphrased with something like donations were made and policy decisions were made by the party shortly after, where even contextual assumptions concerning the link between the donations and the relevant corporations are eliminated in the process of counterfactual reinterpretation. So to conclude, the aim of this presentation was to suggest a new perspective on literal meaning, a new perspective that focuses on judgments about literal meaning and sees these judgments as the result of a process of reflective interpretation, a process that is optional, motivated by argumentative concerns, and that leads to a notion of literal meaning that has to be thought as context-dependent and post-hoc, post-basic interpretation, which, as relevance theory would assume, does not involve the computation of literal meaning, and so it cannot give introspective access to literal meaning itself. So I'll stop here, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Diana. So the floor is now open to questions. We have about 8 minutes. Do I see? Okay, Tom was fast, so please, Tom, ask your question.
Thank you, Teru. Hello, Diana. Nice to see you. Thank you for the talk. I'm currently reading this book. This is Orality and Literacy by Walter Ong. Very influential in media studies, apparently, which is why I'm reading it. And it's got me thinking about the nature of oral cultures where they have zero experience of literacy. And it strikes me that the very notion of literal meaning may only be possible in a literate culture. So in an oral culture where people, there are no lists, there's nothing except what people are saying to one another. That's a connection between your talk and the book that I'm reading that occurred to me while you were talking, and I'm wondering if that makes sense to you, that essentially, what we could call the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, to use an evolutionary psychology term, there's no concept of a literal meaning.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this question. Actually, it allows me to bring into the presentation an element that Christophe and I had left outside for reasons of time, but that is part of the reflections and conversations that we are having. So there is the idea, one of the ideas that we want to suggest is that indeed these caring about literal meaning might be particularly important, not only in context of strategic communication, but also in all those contexts that manifest a need for what we would call the portability of meaning across context, where no repair is possible. So the need for portability could refer to the need to have interpretations of sentences that work across a range of context and in which the evidence of the communicative intention is basically reduced to the verbal material. And indeed, the need of portability, we want to suggest, has been amplified and became prominent with the advent of writing. And writing, and here is a Christophe had this a beautiful idea of introducing this quotation about how Plato describes the reasons why Socrates did not write, which indeed refers to the fact that with writing we lose the possibility of repair on the fly. Does the need to appeal to portable meaning and to judgments about literal meaning. So indeed, there is a part of this project that has to do with the cultural evolution of literal meaning, that looks at the advent of writing as an important factor, and that links these also to the establishment of cultural practices and institutions such as science and law, where literal meaning might play a particularly important role, as in formalism or textualism.
Sorry, Teru, I won't be long, I promise. So writing makes possible portability, but also creates institutions where portability is necessary for them to function properly. At the same time, it makes it possible and necessary. Christophe's nodding. Yeah, we're good.
Good.
Perfect. Thank you. So I see Robin. So Robin.
Hi, Diana. Thank you very much. Really beautiful talk. I haven't thought a huge amount about this particular issue, and certainly not your particular angle on it, which I think is really fascinating and seems right. What I did notice was that you move between talking of literal meaning sometimes, and at other times, I think, literal interpretation. So I don't know whether you're equating those two. I know there was a time when we didn't equate those, where we thought of literal meaning much more in terms of encoded linguistic meaning. And then, of course, there's the whole semantic minimalist school of thought, which talks about the semantic proposition expressed. And there was often a bit of minimal context involved there, because it would involve assigning reference to pronouns and disambiguation and all that kind of thing. So this is all very different from any kind of reflective process such as you have been discussing. I'm just trying to kind of situate these various different notions of the way in which people have talked about literal meaning over the decades, and how they sort of sit with your viewpoint.
Yes, so indeed, here I'm going back to this table, because indeed it's in the context of this table that we suggest the idea that we should think about this notion of context-dependent literal meaning that is the object of these judgments about literal meaning, folk judgments of literal meaning, as different from the type of semantic and sub-propositional meaning that could be seen as preceding pragmatic interpretation or feeding the input of pragmatic interpretation. So we want to keep these two notions separate, and indeed one of the point that we tried to develop with the presentations of these two scenarios was the point that indeed these judgments about literal meaning might be very much context dependent, and that so leading to literal meanings that differ across contexts for the very same utterance. Going back to the work on semantic minimalism, one of the idea on which I think there is some alignment between this view and the view that Emma Borg has recently expressed is the fact that although literal meaning might not play an important role, and actually plays no role in basic spontaneous interpretation, it might have an important, she calls it sociolinguistic function, and what we want to say is argumentative social function. So it might indeed be relevant in argumentative context, although it has no role to play and it does not figure in a cognitive account of basic interpretation. What we want to do with this project is to try to still put some cognitive pragmatic lenses on the analysis of how these judgments about literal meaning are produced, and hence the idea of this literalist mode of interpretation. I hope it clarifies a bit where we situate ourselves in this scenario.
Yes, it does. Thank you very much. Can I just follow up with one very brief thing, which is, so the very first interpretation you gave, you know, the one with all the enrichments and what have you, that was also a literal interpretation, was it? So on this picture?
On this picture, for instance, as you can see here, the very first interpretation would not be a literal, it would often not correspond to judgments about the literal meaning, because judgments about literal meaning come into play only when there is some dispute or about what's the right interpretation, or when there is this effort to avoid misunderstanding because of the possibility of denial and anticipation of denial. But as you might have seen, in these two examples, I've tried to show graphically the fact that in these judgments about literal meaning, there are still elements that we would traditionally qualify as coming from pragmatic enrichments that might be part of this notion of literal meaning. And crucially, the extent to which these pragmatic enrichments are part of these judgments might be dependent on the strategic interest at stake in different contexts, so that, for instance, when we moved from the first to the second scenario, we moved from this type of representation of the literal meaning to a representation that is much stricter in the second scenario, where additional enrichment are thought to be not attributable as part of what the speaker literally meant. So yeah, I hope it clarifies.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you again, Diana.